This is the cover, Genesis on Planet Earth, from the Bio-Origin series from Yale University Press. And it has a foreword by one of the people that we're concerned with at this phase of nature. Her name is Lynn Margulies, and she has been a champion for two sets of concerns for the last 50 years. She's concerned with sex, and she's concerned with Gaia, that the planet is a living being, that the Earth is not only whole in the sense that it's just one thing, but that it is a living being. And so the whole interface recently in her work is how sexuality, which for her originates in bacteria, becomes an essential layering of the way in which the frequency of energy in nature registers in life forms all the way up to planets. We live in a time where all the planets of our star system are now seeming more and more like a family. And this is an article, Colonizing the Solar System, from the Atlantic Monthly by Freeman Dyson, who is a longtime friend of Lynn Margulies. And in his book, Origins of Life, this is the second revised edition from Cambridge University Press, he presents her as a very major figure in the world. In fact, one of Freeman Dyson's books concerns sex and Gaia. It's called From Eros to Gaia. And if you're not familiar with Freeman Dyson, he's one of the world's great mathematical physicists. We are concerned in our learning to try to follow through phases that have occurred in reality so that our education recapitulates the actual steps, the actual stages by which we became real over the last 4 billion years. And in this, there is a kind of a funneling effect, not a condensation, not a reduction, but the more proper term for it is an integral. That life in nature has a mode which is characteristic all the way through on every level and gives the tint to the whole quality of the composition. And that is that nature in its ecology is an integral, and that integrals the definiteness of things, the discrete quanta of things, is only possible because there is a complement to it, and the complement to all forms is the background. And what we're understanding is that the background in nature is a continuity that occurs before existence registers, so that the registry of existentials, which in our habitual orientation, in our old-fashioned education, was always the starting place, always the starting point, is not really the starting point at all, but are secondary, they're second phase occurrences. And one of the easiest ways to understand this, every high school student in the world who takes geometry begins still with some lessons from Euclid of 2,300 years ago, and the very first lesson in the geometry textbooks in high school is the definition of a point and 2 points that make a line, and those lines make a plane. And this is a misstatement because Euclid's Greek is very clear. It translates that a point is a locus of no dimension. that the ancient understanding of geometricity is that it is emergent out of a zero dimension openness, so vast that it is also completely full. And the Greek word for it was pleroma. So that the zero and the infinity of nature's continuum is exactly what is primordial, and allows for existence to emerge out of that, and emerge exactly and definitely, and has a couple of characteristics which are always there. It is always exactly there and cinched because there has come into play a polarity, a polarizing, where two opposites have come together and cinched it, positive and negative for electrical, male and female for everything from bacteria up, that opposites in their polarization, cinching together, make it possible for existentials to be really and precisely there. And at the same time, they are unities. They're always ones. But as we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the ones occur within the capacity to have an integral ratio that holds just as unity would hold, so that one can always write 1 as 1 over 1, so that relationalities in proportions and ratios are characteristic of nature and occur before existentiality occurs. So that it's not so much that trigonometry is an advance of geometry, but that trigonometric relations occur before geometric forms. And that the historical development of mathematics is topsy-turvy in this sense. And the ancient understanding of trigonometric relations, though it could not have been presented mathematically until it was mooted in late Roman Alexandria, the 2nd, 3rd centuries AD, but it was put into practice some 3000 BC in China in the I Ching. And so we began our nature phase of our learning with the I Ching. And also, in order to bring in a complement to that, to the sense that there was a relationality of proportionate change before things became definite, we brought into play with the I Ching the figure of Henry David Thoreau. Because Thoreau was, in a sense, for us, for the last several generations, the exemplar of the natural man for whom there was such a thing as natural history, and that this natural history meant not that you looked at it from the outside, but that you participated with it, so that your participation was a flow within the energy of natural change, which allowed you to become sensitive to the zero and infinite continuum of nature before you began reducing it in the mind to existential points, which then you made connecting the dots into shapes that only confirmed what tradition used to say about it, or what your normal learning would have prepared you to expect. And oh yes, we found it, and so this must be true. All of that we learned in the 20th century. It was not only questionable, it was deceptive. And so in the 21st century, we are freeing ourselves of crippling flaws that doomed every civilization that our forebears and ancestors developed. And we are trying to learn in such a way as to sidestep the flaws which are always fatal. And one of them is to project the need to be definite before the emergence out of a natural preparation that allows for that definiteness to be exact and not preemptively shaped according to the mind. Tim Leary once said in a talk that I sponsored on one of his books on intelligence being the ultimate saboteur. It's the flawed intelligence of false learnedness and of phony society and of damaged civilization that always throws out its spiel, its spin, before we have an opportunity to get the tone, to inhabit the temperature, to participate in the energy. And we're taking along with Lynn Margulies, James D. Watson, of the famous Watson and Crick, the discovery of the structure of DNA, and we're using a pair of books as we always do. We're using pairedness, the double helix in this beautiful Norton Critical Edition by Gunther Stent, who is a friend of Watson for about 50 years and a great biologist on his own. And we're using from Lynn Margulies her fabulous 1998 book called Symbiotic Planet, A New Look at Evolution. We're taking Watson and Margulis not just as a man and a woman, but they're interesting in very poignant ways. For instance, Lynn Margulis and James D. Watson could very easily have turned out to be juvenile delinquents. They were that kind of youngsters. I talked last week about how Lynn Margulis took herself out of the 8th grade in the place that she was put by circumstance and enrolled herself at a completely different school and wasn't caught until 8 months later. The school she was enrolled in was a school for special intellectual children at the University of Chicago. And the school she wanted to go to was Hyde Park High School because it was a public high school. And there were more interesting boys and more of them. And so she enrolled herself and didn't let her parents know or anyone know. And of course, when she was caught, they almost threw her out. But at age 14, Lynn Margulis passed all the entrance exams to the University of Chicago and was admitted as a special student. And at the age of 17, she got her degree at the University of Chicago. She was born in 1938, so that put it into the mid-50s, 1955. What's interesting is that a completely similar kind of a character, but of a different cut, was there at the University of Chicago, about 5 years older than her. He was raised in the poverty of New York City. His father cut out patterns of cloth for rows and rows of women to sew together and make blouses, and that man was Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan, one of the really great early geniuses of exploring the solar system as a prism through which we will be able to see the entire cosmos in a new way, was sent to the University of Chicago in the early 1950s. And while he was there, he met the precocious 14-year-old Lynn Margulis, and of course they became lovers. And of course they ended up having several children together and a very tempestuous marriage. She says in Symbiotic Planet, "My fellow student, the budding astronomer Carl Sagan, was nearly 5 years my senior. Tall, handsome, with a shock of brown-black hair and exceedingly articulate. Even then, he was full of ideas." He was 19 years old. "I literally ran into him one day as I was bounding up the steps of Eckert Hall, the mathematics building. 19-year-old Sagan at that time was poised to launch his astronomical career. He was a graduate student of physics, but a fast-moving, enthusiastic, ignorant girl as I was. But I was a scientific ignoramus. Carl, and especially his gift of gab, fascinated me. So she began merging her interest in sexuality with science, just to keep up with her new boyfriend, if nothing else. And as she did, her genius flowered in a most amazing way. She found that those two interests were actually very compatible. And it was interesting because Sagan was discovering at the same time that he could be an astronomer. He was told just the year before, at age 18, he went to see his immigrant grandfather in New York City and told him that he wanted to become an astronomer, and his grandfather said it had to be translated because he didn't speak English. The grandfather said, well, that's fine, but what will you do to make a living? But when he got to the University of Chicago, one of the really interesting, great figures who was there at the time, the only astronomer in the United States who had made not only a profession of astronomy, but was envisioning the profession of astronomy blossoming out into 1,000 different ways. The man's name was Gerard Kuiper. He was a Dutch man who immigrated to the United States young, and he was the director of the program at the University of Chicago in astronomy. And Kuiper became the man famous because he was the first director of the Planetary Studies Institute in Tucson. He was also the director of all the early NASA programs exploring the moon for the first time. He was a project engineer and mathematician and astronomer on the Ranger program, the first time that anything was sent to the moon. And we had about 20,000 photographs of the moon back, Rangers 7, 8, and 9. And Kuiper, in one of the interviews at the time, said, we have not learned 10 times more or 100, we've learned thousands of times more suddenly in the last couple of months. And that there is the sense of an explosiveness to our understanding. And that faced with this, all of a sudden it became apparent to just a handful of people at the time, this was in the 1960s, that we had entered into crossing a threshold that was rather startling. While the 1940s had a tone of courageous survival of the Second World War and a can-do kind of attitude, the 1950s in the United States was, I.F. Stone characterized at one time as the haunted 50s. It was a population that were suddenly not can-do, but fearful because the Cold War garroted the entire mentality. And people were wondering if they should put in bomb shelters with their children. Whereas by the 1960s, it was apparent. By 1965, by early 1966, it was apparent that what was happening was an epical transform of our species. That we were no longer going to be geographically terrestrial, and that we were going to be graphically celestial. And we were going to have to learn how to evolve very rapidly into that new phase of species of ourselves. And it became apparent that this required a completely different orientation. In the 1950s, there were just a couple of places in the United States where you could have the new learning. And the University of Chicago was the center of that. The reason being is that at the University of Chicago, since the 1940s, the man in charge of it was Robert Hutchins, Robert M. Hutchins. His first book was called Education for Freedom. This book, at once a trenchant statement of the crisis facing higher learning in America and a proposal for making cultivation of the intellect once more the essential aim of education. And Carl Sagan, in one of his last books called The Demon-Haunted World, subentitled Science as a Candle in the Dark, 1996, just before he died. He said, at the University of Chicago, I was lucky enough to go through a general education program devised by Robert M. Hutchins, where science was presented as an integral part of the gorgeous tapestry of human knowledge. It was considered unthinkable for an aspiring physicist not to know Plato, Aristotle, Bach, Shakespeare, Gibbon, Malinowski, and Freud, among many others. And in this particular thing, he found teachers who fulfilled his dream, like G.P. Kuiper. He said, it was from Kuiper that I first got a feeling for what is called back of the envelope calculation. It's a technique. A possible explanation to a problem occurs to you. You pull out an old envelope, appeal to your knowledge of fundamental physics, scribble a few approximate equations on the envelope, substitute in likely numerical values, and see if your answer comes anywhere near to explaining your problem. If not, you look for a different explanation. It cuts through nonsense like a knife through butter. It is a mathematical form of divination. It is like the ancient primordial I Ching, only instead of throwing yarrow stalks or looking at tortoise shells or flipping coins, one goes into very high dharma, instant revealing to oneself. And when you do this, what comes out of it has a different tone. It doesn't come out as a mental symbol form. It comes out as a ritual existential form, and its emergence is not out of experience, but out of nature. When existentials emerge out of nature, they are what we would call exactly real. They are actual. They cannot lie. They're like little children. It's impossible for them to lie. They will show that it doesn't work. But if they indicate that it's possible to work, you can again go through many iterations of this procedure over some short duration of time, and you can come out with a seed insight that can really be developed. And if you take that seed insight out of existentiality and plant it in the mind, in the symbol field, then the mind's integral will bring that into a full sphere all by itself, because it will be a natural process. This is very deep. In ancient times, it was called wisdom, as opposed to merely epistemological confirmation. The difference at one time popularly said it's the difference between gnosis and episteme. It's the difference between aha and it does no good to pound existentials that are constantly shifting on every conceivable energy registry in their strings, in their subatomic particles, in their microbial developments, in their energy relationships. All of this makes it naive to base one's sense of sureness and certainty on what you can pound. Lynn Margulis and James D. Watson exemplify for us a pair of persons with exemplary books, a pair of books that allow us to go back a third plateau from where we began in nature. When we began with the I Ching and Thoreau, we went back several thousand years, about 5,000 years. And we stayed with that for 4 presentations for a month for a lunar cycle. Then we shifted to another pair, and we opened it up for another lunar cycle, another 4 weeks, only this time we went to Margulis and carried ourselves back several million years. And if you look at the exemplars of what we have in our outline, you can see that for nature, there is definitely a quality of this second phase, Mary Leakey's discovering the past and Jane Goodall's Through a Window, with not only the Paleolithic origin of our species, but back several species before our own. Not just back 2 million years, but back about 5 or 6 million years, and then with Jane Goodall back about 70 million years. So we moved from thousands of years to millions of years. And now, with Lynn Margulies and James D. Watson, we're taking a third step and we're going back billions of years. And it's not just that life has occurred on this planet in the bacterial, sexual microbe mode for 3 billion years, but that the forerunners of life go back even further. And that this particular star system is very young. It's only 4.5 billion years old. And there are stars that formed over 13 billion years ago. So there have been star systems at least 3 or 4 times longer than we've been in business. And that life, as we understand it now, is not just endemic to reality, to the universe. It is characteristically, it's integral. That the universe integrates itself by being alive. And this is one of the theses of Gaia, the living planet. The planet is not just alive. It is a planet because it is alive, the living being. In ancient times, there were always spirits of living things. Even animals had spirits, plants had spirits, people had spirits. The planets had spirits. And the whole basis of early astrology was to consult not the planets, but the spirits of those planets, the spirits of those stars. So that one had then a early template of how resonant livingness occurs together in such a way that they are relational from the get-go as they come out, and that they constitute not only unities in themselves, but their relationality as a pattern is also a unity, is unified. So it isn't that one is ever dealing with multiplicity in nature, one is dealing with complexity of unity. It's a totally different outlook. And when you look at complexity of unity, then the largest sphere becomes not a limiting bound, but becomes a dynamic threshold of further development. We know now from early 21st century astronomy that when the universe was born in the popularly called Big Bang, that explosiveness was such a super hot plasma that it took several 100,000 years for it to blow itself out of the glowing plasma fireball, and when it did, it blew itself out of light. And there was a whole period for almost 1 billion years of darkness in the universe. And then slowly, in the darkness, the materia that had been formed out of the density wave inconsistencies in that early plasma had formed particles, and particles had formed atoms, and atoms had formed different molecules, and they had come together, and after about 1 billion years, the first big stars formed, and as they formed, as they came back into light, the universe lit up again. The early plasma had ionized the subparticle energy of the universe, and when the first stars came in, about 13 billion years ago, they, with their ultraviolet light, re-ionized the universe. What that means is that all the neutral hydrogen and neutral helium that had been dark for 1 billion years received the first ultraviolet radiation that came through the universe, and it ionized the hydrogen and helium atoms so that they were now able not just to be neutral and just there, but the entire universe became available for joining and for making life emergently possible. And so the universe, with the second coming of light, came alive. And so the understanding now, by 2004, and it's just beginning to have its openness, is that there is a great unbounded unity which has a dynamic to it, which is an energy before form happens. In advanced astrophysics, such a sphere is called a Stromberg sphere. Stromberg sphere is the ultraviolet radiation that comes out and precedes everything else. And so everything that we can see constitutes 4% of what is really there. And all the rest of it is dark matter and dark energy that is not just left over, but is still potent in nature and not yet existential. And so most of reality is natural in the continuum and not existentially cinched into its polarities and stabilities. And so to be real, an education like ourselves, an interstellar learning is what it is, to not only recalibrate ourselves and what we know, but to relive all over again and rebirth all over again ourselves out of this primordiality of nature as a basic, mysterious continuum. And one of the ways in which we can do this, James D. Watson, in a section, a beautiful page, in one of his latest books, 2003, DNA, The Secret of Life. And the frontispiece here is photographs of human beings, thousands of them, lit differently with colors so that they form the structure of DNA. He says on page 148, the chapter characteristically entitled by James D. Delinquent Watson. His middle name is Dewey, actually, John Dewey, James Dewey Watson. But he is a delinquent. The title is Tempest in a Cereal Box. But listen to the beauty and the new angle of vision that suddenly illuminates like a candle in the dark, like human intelligence re-ionizing itself like the first stars and sending out the Stromberg sphere of a new consciousness. Bruce Ames, who devised the Ames test, is a procedure widely relied upon for determining whether or not a particular substance is carcinogenic. Has noted that the natural elements in our food are every bit as lethal as the noxious chemicals we worry about. Referring to tests on rats, he takes coffee as an example. There are more rodent carcinogens in 1 cup of coffee than pesticide residues you get in a year. So, and there's still 1,000 chemicals left to analyze in a cup of coffee. So it just shows our double standard. If it's synthetic, we really freak out. If it's natural, we forget about it. One ingenious set of chemical defenses in plants involves furanocoumarins, a group of chemicals that become toxic only when directly exposed to ultraviolet light. By this natural adaptation, the toxins are activated only when a herbivore starts munching on the plants, breaking open the cells and exposing their contents to sunlight. Furanocoumarins present in the peel of limes were responsible for a bizarre plague that struck a Club Med resort in the Caribbean. The guests who found themselves afflicted by rashes on their thighs, ugly rashes, all participated in a game which involved passing a lime from one person to the next without using hands, feet, or arms, or head. In the bright Caribbean sunlight, this activated the furanocoumarins in the humiliated lime, and it wreaked a terrible revenge on numerous thighs. Plants and herbivores are involved in an evolutionary arms race. Nature selects plants to be ever more toxic and herbivores to be ever more efficient at detoxifying the plant's defense substance while metabolizing the nutritious ones. In the face of furanocoumarins, some herbivores have evolved a clever countermeasure. Caterpillars, for example, roll up a leaf before starting to munch. Sunlight does not penetrate the shady confines of the leaf roll, and thus the furanocoumarins are not activated. We need to be as intelligent as caterpillars. Like the experience of Alice in Wonderland, when we are asked by the caterpillar, "Who are you?" we have to be able to reply, "We will find out as we continue to expand." Let's take a break. The appearance of Carl Sagan and Lynn Margulis at the University of Chicago in the early 1950s was very fortuitous. What's also interesting is that James D. Watson grew up in the Chicago area as well. His parents finally owned a house just at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, not far from Chicago, where there are still sand dunes. And his parents' house was right at the edge of the big white sand dunes on the bottom of Lake Michigan. I remember as a boy being able to run so fast down the sand dunes that you could tumble and almost go into Lake Michigan. And Chicago in the 1940s had a resurgence of its culture. When Chicago was rebuilt after the Great Fire in the 19th century, it became two things at once. Because it was completely rebuilt, the late 19th century industrial might of the new post-Civil War United States was asserted on a scale that had rarely ever been seen before. We have to understand that the industrial might was centered upon the ability for man to handle steel, on the extent of being able to build railways that spanned hundreds, if not, in the United States, it wasn't just hundreds, but thousands of miles, to build buildings that would be truly skyscrapers. And all of this power, this industrial might came to Chicago, and at the same time, this great confidence of bringing new ideas into play. And his first major teaching role, John Dewey, was there in Chicago. And he and his wife, Evelyn, organized one of the first of the new progressive schools. And they wrote a book together on it in 1900 out of Chicago. Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright were just remaking architecture into a new Chicago America kind of a form, the first really high-rise, beautiful structures ever built, and many other qualities. But the industrial might overshadowed the intellectual acumen, and by 1906, you had someone like Upton Sinclair writing The Jungle, about the bestiality of human beings having to work in the Chicago meatpacking places. And it was like a terrible embarrassment to Chicago to be characterized as a butcher hell for human beings. And so you had a resurgence around 1910 of a new Chicago, a renaissance in Chicago. And in this was a consciousness to bring out the humanity of people in the community. And you had, as the great heroine of that, Jane Addams. And Jane Addams' Hull House was one of the first places in the world where there was a concerted effort to interface the intellectual elite with the industrial elite on the basis of a ratioed, a sharing community of the dispossessed who would have been on the margins and left out, and they were worked in because they became the important membrane of interface of these two great, powerful levels of society. And Jane Addams would bring speakers to Hull House from all over the world, distinguished people, so as to show this is not about a food kitchen. This is about remaking the urban community on a scale. By that time, Chicago was well over 1 million people. And it became not only powerful economically, because it was the center of all the railroads on the American continent, but it became the place in which intelligent action and intellectual forms of society and life were explored to the ultimate. And in this, the great figure was Robert M. Hutchins at the University of Chicago. His trigger was this study. This study is entitled The Education of Free Men in American Democracy. It's published by the Educational Policies Commission, the National Education Association of the United States, and the American Association of School Administrators. And it was commissioned as a study in 1940 as a part of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt's America to Face Up to a Challenge. And here on page 11, this was published in 1941, but the report was finished in December 1940, and it was undertaken in the fall of 1940. It was undertaken at a time in October of 1940, when I was born, when France fell to the Nazis. And it was apparent that this was going to be something even worse than the Great War that had happened 20 years before. Chapter 2 is entitled Totalitarian Strategy and Dynamic Democracy. And just the first couple of sentences tell it. The rising tide of despotism threatens the cause of human freedom with catastrophe. The situation calls for bold and resolute action. A spirit of defeatism is utterly foreign to the tradition of liberty, a tradition which has been built up through the centuries painfully at great sacrifice. A spirit of defeatism, moreover, is not justified by the facts. And out of this, just a year or so later, came Hutchins' Education for Reform, published in 1943. And then 10 years later, in 1953, came the University of Utopia, where the earlier outlook had been one about the hazards outside the United States. All of a sudden, by 1953, it was the hazards in the United States. This book is about the hazards to education in the United States. The principal ones seem to be those associated with industrialization, specialization, philosophical diversity, social and political conformity. Industrialization seems to charm people into thinking that the prime aim of life and hence of education is the development of industrial power. Specialization has dire effects upon the effort to build up a community, and particularly a community of the learned. Philosophic diversity raises the question whether a community is possible at all. And social and political conformity, on the other hand, suggests that a kind of community we seem to be headed for is one that we shall not like when we get it. This was 50 years ago. This came out at the time of the double helix. Watson grew up in this kind of Chicago, in this quality where he realized as a youngster that you had to be dynamic and ahead not only of the curve, but you had to be ahead of something that plagued him almost all his life. And it is a peculiar sensitivity in Watson that he was sensitive that one could be outdone by a contingency, by mere circumstance. And so here in this volume that just came out, Watson and DNA, The Making of a Scientific Revolution, Chapter 2, Target the Gene, the writer starts off, contingency always fascinated Jim Watson. How easily things could have turned out differently. How narrowly he missed reaching a dead end. In his last year at Chicago, as he was finishing his degree in zoology and applying to graduate schools, chance played a big role. His plans were all so improbable. As a relic of his old aspirations to be a naturalist and a curator of birds at some top museum, he mentioned ornithology as an interest in his applications. He had little formal training in genetics, and yet genetics was what he intended to study. The California Institute of Technology, Caltech, in Pasadena was strong in genetics, but they turned him down. Was the C in physics, or distrust of Robert Hutchins' unconventional policies at the University of Chicago? Harvard, weak in genetics at the time, accepted him but offered no financial assistance. And then he applied to Indiana as well, and because he mentioned ornithology as an interest to him, he was granted leave to go there and to enter. And Indiana University in Bloomington happened to have one of the most interesting men in the world doing microbiological studies, Salvador E. Luria. And under Luria was the first time that Watson understood you cannot wait for someone to make a circumstance for you. You have to take the lead and you have to be the spearhead, because the circumstance will gather around the most comprehensive dynamic. It's a principle. It's an integral principle of nature. It is the vector that synthesizes the most energy on the widest range that carries the dynamic. And the dynamic that it carries is time in change. The movement of change that occurs when we measure it is time. But what is brought into synthesis, into being sensed into existentiality so that it really does happen, it's actually there now, is that energy is constellated in definite ratios and proportions, so that if you bring two hydrogen and an oxygen together, you get a very unstable mix until you get water as a molecule. Then H2O becomes something definite, a molecule of water. That the registry of actuality is the way in which energy is brought to a precise, exact focus within the dynamic of the continuum of nature as not so much movement, but of change that then allows for movement to register in its proper sequencing. And so we see that all of the material was there like a premonition template for the structure of DNA. And that its synthesizing is not on the basis of some kind of simple command structure that then directs, but rather it's always pairs that occur together that not so much direct, but they make the synthesizing focus as an integral in the actual time occurrence, so that sequencing then registers real wherever it really can. It's like preparing the mix and then putting in the lightning, and what you will get are the early amino acids that will make life. Watson used this technique for 50 years to build one of the most impressive careers anyone has ever seen in science. This was published in 2003. It's called Inspiring Science. It's a whole honoring of James Watson's 50 years with Jim Watson and the age of DNA. And he singled out, and we talked last week about one of the reasons why Watson is so important and important for us, is that he activates the entire array of resonances enough so that they fill the complete set of a form. He investigated not only DNA, but he investigated also the gene. He investigated the cell. He investigated the institutes that do the research. He investigated the community at large by writing all kinds of books like The Double Helix to appeal to them. He could write, and did write, dozens and dozens of scientific articles, and yet he could inspire the academic community by writing a book like A Passion for DNA, Genes, Genomes, and Society, and at the very same time, he could fascinate the public by writing Genes, Girls, and Gamow. George Gamow, the great mathematical physicist. So that Watson spent his whole life activating all of these resonances that together formed the set of a scientific community. And here in Inspiring Science on page 430, it's a little tribute to Watson by a man named Bruce M. Alberts, National Academy of Science, What I Have Learned from Jim. And the little note in a box says, in 1978, with Molecular Biology of the Gene in its third edition, and we showed last week, the first edition of 1965 was a little paperback. The second edition of 1970, again a paperback a little bit larger, and then all of a sudden, in 1976, just 6 years later, the third edition was 1,200, 1,300 pages in 2 big volumes. In 3 little steps, it had moved from a couple of hundred pages as a throwaway paperback to one of the most successful scientific textbooks ever used. And of course, now by 2004, the 5th edition comes out, 2,500 pages and 2 huge volumes. And Watson has carried it almost single-handedly. Not just that he is the only writer, but he was the synthesizing writer who kept bringing in other younger writers to co-author with him. And at the same time, to co-author with them, they had to bring their learning up to his level. And because he was constantly advancing, not just staying at the level that he had attained, as he could well have after winning the Nobel Prize and gaining tenure, he could have just relaxed. He didn't. He accelerated. He tromped the accelerator pedal and kept expanding it more and more, so that it reads here, in 1978, with Molecular Biology of the Gene and its third edition, 1976, and clearly a success, Jim Watson conceived the idea of a new textbook designed to integrate traditional cell biology with ideas and techniques of molecular biology. It was the first time anyone ever visioned this. Among the authors, he recruited all young, none with previous experience with textbooks or writing. Among them was Bruce Alberts, whom he had known first as a Harvard graduate student under him, and had just been appointed a professor at UC California, San Francisco, at the medical school. All of a sudden, alongside of the third edition of Molecular Biology of the Gene came a huge textbook, the Molecular Biology of the Cell. So you jump from DNA to the gene to the cell. You're on your way. You're building accumulated resonances that extend not only the power of the understanding and the power of the conception, but extend, like a Stromberg sphere, the pre-consciousness of relationality of the unknown that really occurs but doesn't register. It isn't that it's there. The unknown is not there. The future is not there. But it is occurring in nature already. The ancient understanding of this was eternity. In Plato's Timaeus, the statement in Greek translates very easily. Time is the moving image of eternity. Nature occurs eternally, but existence occurs iteratively, always again, in a cycle of emergence, flourishing, stability, time decay, reemergence back into nature, reemergence back into existence. An ecology. In the ancient Chinese, it is the Tao energy cycle. 5-phase. Tao, Te, Gen, Yi, Qi, which returns back to Tao. The only thing, Qi will always return back to Tao. And Tao will always emerge Te. And Te, because it has emerged pristine from Tao, always delivers Gen. The item in that 5-phase energy cycle that is problematic is the E. The E are the symbols in the mind. It is the symbols in man's mind that are the only stopping place in the whole ecology of nature, of its integral. If the ideas are deceptive, they back up so that the energy process of Gen, human-heartedness, becomes swampy and distorted. And when it does, it overflows and goes back and contaminates the Te, the ritual action comportments, and instead of being life-giving, they become life-reducing, curtailing. And then you run into big problems because a crippled, distorted Te cannot emerge out of Tao, and so you have only an artificial existentiality, nothing real. And increasingly, as we will see in our learning, because rituals and symbols confirm with each other by their alignment, if both are crippled, their alignment seems true, and there's no way for them to tell that they are both distorted. And increasingly, as they run through a kind of a false time, a calendrical clock time of authority and industrial might, political arrangements, increasingly the mind and the ritual actions of society seem more and more smooth because This is how they should be, and they are more and more artificial. And what happens then is they reach a breaking point. And the break doesn't come in the mind. It doesn't come in the rituals. It comes because experience is no longer able to breathe, and it suffocates. It's no longer able to digest what is there, and it chokes itself to death. And so it's in Jen, in human-heartedness, that you find the travail and the tragedy. But that travail and that tragedy are because of false ideation. Instead of symbols with ideas, you get ideologies with isms. You get programs that are directed and programmed and inculcated and enforced. You will do it this way. What does Ahab say on the deck of the Pequod at a big trigger moment in Moby Dick, where Starbuck says, "You're becoming maniacal, you're too grand for all this." And Ahab says to him, "Starbuck, you and I have played out this role 1 billion years before these seas ever rolled." And Starbuck says, "You're lying under the sun." And Ahab says, "Man, I'd strike the sun if it insulted me." That kind of monolithic craziness reasserts itself, especially at the crisis end of civilizations, as we are living in now. But those crisis ends are also thresholds of the new. It's also that time where, if one can carry nature as a continuum invisibly, in the real emergent ritual comportment, actions of actual existential form forward, the experience that will come out of that will be rich enough and varied enough that the mind will have natural symbols. And the ideas will be alive and life-giving rather than deadening and corralling. Instead of ideologies, they will be ideas. And one of the great things about ideas, the first person to use idea in this way was the Greek of Plato. The idea is capable of transformation by consciousness. It is not just that the idea is something objectively and statically, but that the idea is a pattern of relationality that is objective, and it means that all the proportions of the constituents of an idea now constitute a relational structure which has the ability to generate a sphere, and it's out of that sphere that consciousness comes into play. In both East and West, the blessed were always shown with a sphere over their heads, with a halo, with a nimbus of openness, a Stromberg sphere of holiness, because they were open-minded. Not open-minded just to new ideas, they were open-minded to reality, and are blessed because of that. 1983 was the first edition, and Molecular Biology of the Cell by 1994 had this kind of quality to it. It was the world standard textbook in molecular biology, and now the fourth edition is out and is extraordinary. One can take the molecular biology of the cell, and here you just open it, a couple of pages about all the different kinds of tissues that there are and how they work and their structure. And the book goes through thousands of pages of development. Not only the synthesizing symbol of the neural cell on the cover, but on the back cover, James Watson with his 5 young authors walking across the street together, and Watson's in the back with his pork pie hat, letting his younger confrères go ahead, because he always has been concerned with building the scientific community on the level of 1-to-1 and a group at a time, and an entire lab that now And Long Island spreads a great deal of the north shore of one of the bays. Actually, Cold Spring Harbor Lab is not very far from Walt Whitman's birthplace on Long Island. A fitting reminder. But here, in the DNA story, also by James Watson, the epilogue. He writes in here, for 8 years, this is 1981, for 8 years, recombinant DNA research was placed under constraints that were crippling. Only in the last 2 years have those constraints been relaxed to the present point where for most research with standard host vector systems, they are no longer a serious impediment. Of course, we've lived to see that reversed again in our time. That so much new and totally unexpected has been learned since 1973. This was 8 years before they wrote this book. In just 8 years, the proliferation of questions was what you would call in mathematics asymptotic. That is, they proliferated at a scale to where there were exponentially more issues in such small increments of time that the graph goes straight up, goes off the graph. And they realized that what had happened here was that the power of thought to explore nature had risen to such a white-hot energy that there was no way to slam on the brakes without doing a permanent damage, and that is that it would make an ism with all that energy instead of an exploration with ideas of all that energy. It's known as an apocalypse. If you slam on the brakes going full speed, you're going to flip the vehicle. You don't do it. It's not done. When he realized what was coming in the late 1980s, that science was more and more being seen in a kind of a Frankenstein mode, he expanded the stakes again to a colossal level that was absurd. He was the first one to vision the possibility of doing the entire human genome. And here, because the genome is now accomplished, Nature, the scientific international journal, has published The Human Genome with the foreword by James D. Watson, because he was the man who first put it out. He was the first director of it. He was the one that not only organized it as an endeavor, but marshaled all of the people involved so that they could work together, and also saw where techniques that had not been developed needed to be developed at the same time as marshaling the people. So you make the capacity to do the techniques at the same time that you're maturing the population, at the same time that you're making the project so that it can really happen, and making the interface so that it will actually work in the larger levels of society. And Watson was the composer and conductor for this entire project. And when you come to seeing it and understanding it, it would have been impossible without the ability to exponentially increase our ability to sequence DNA. So here on page 24 and 25 is a little précis of how you sequence DNA and how you can step that up so that you can sequence billions of DNA in just a very short time. It reads here, how to sequence DNA. Step A, there's a DNA polymerase. It's called PRC, polymerase, PCR, polymerase chain reaction. DNA polymerase copies a strand of DNA. This strand, the insertion of a terminator base into a growing strand, halts the copying process. A strand of DNA is put in, begins to replicate, it's stopped. This is a random event that results in a series of fragments of different lengths. In other words, it's reiterated. It's sent through. Now, it seems like it's chance. What it is change. It's stopped randomly, but randomness is not chance. Randomness is an unbounded matrix of change. Is a completely different thing. It has everything to do with chaos theory that came out at this time. Not just fractalization, but the fact if you run randomness fast enough in a large enough complexity, it will generate a universal form. It's called the infinity sign, the double attractor, the butterfly effect. That will emerge, and it emerges not because anyone made it emerge, it emerges because it is true to reality eternally. So you run this strand of DNA with random breaks, many iterations, and all of these iterations, then the fragments are separated by size by running them through a gel matrix, with the shortest fragments at the bottom, the largest at the top. Now you have a parfait. The terminators are labeled with different fluorescent dyes so that each fragment will fluoresce a particular color depending on whether it ends with A, C, G, or T, the 4 bases for DNA. The sequence then, overlay, is read by a computer. It generates a sequence trace as shown here with colored hillocks corresponding to fluorescent bands, read from bottom to top, just like the Chinese used to read the trigrams of the I Ching from bottom to top. So that what you do is that you read a set of resonances that are complete, and because they're complete, if you read the set as a matrix wholly, a form will emerge that is true. Every single time. And because it is true, it means that every proportion and ratio of its wholeness can be also derived, and they also will be true. It's not dependent on logic. It's dependent upon a process of emerging from eternity realistically so that all the existentials are whole, all the relationalities are whole. In this way, truth is made. What is truth? It's the real structure of what then continues, the natural ecology. And we can see from this is where Lynn Margulies comes in a very big way. She and her oldest son, Dorian Sagan, she married Carl Sagan, and they had a family of 3 boys and a girl, and then Sagan married again and had a couple of more children. But here, her oldest son and herself, in 1989, did a book called Biospheres. Biospheres from Earth to Space, because the whole idea here is to understand how there can be a life sphere independent of the geography of the Earth. And that those life spheres then are biospheres, and they have taken a lot of trouble to research all this and put it together, like Jim Watson, to make sure that all the different levels and resonances are all refreshed and that they're all a part of the mix, so that when you bring the lightning of a great synthesizing idea into play, the mix is enriched enough to deliver a new form. If you put the whole saturation to the right to the edge of completeness and you add a little bit of energy, it will crystallize the matrix out and the structure will be there. And you will have the jewel of the true. And so she, like Watson, has done this. One of the things they brought out was a translation of The Biosphere by the great Russian Vladimir Vernadsky, written in 1926. A classic. It was the first time that anyone had ever written about a biosphere the way that we would understand it today. Part of what Lynn Margulies has done is to activate all the elements of a matrix, just like James D. Watson has done. Only her concern here is not with microbiology being able to understand everything from DNA through genes, through cells, through the genome, to the community, to the informed world, but how it is that we fit into a living planet, billions of years old, and that what is important in this is that sex is a quality of organic life that does not originate with human desire or embarrassment. It begins with bacteria 3 billion years ago. And that it is because of the ultraviolet radiation that challenged bacteria at that time, they began to find new ways to have relationalities, and in those bacterial cooperative communities, sex was born. And out of this came the ability to generate a new kind of cellular structure. And out of that came a further transform that led to the development of cells that have a nucleus. And once one has the pair, the nucleus with its membrane and the cell with its membrane, because of this paired double calibration of the way in which energy enters into those kinds of cells are able to open up the integral structure of life so that you begin now to have different kinds of beings that were never possible before. Complex beings like ourselves. And more next week.